help us understand where the parts are going to be and whatnot, I took the rear legs and I stood them up, and I took the front legs and I put them here as well. And they're a little bit farther apart than the rear legs, and that's on purpose. So if you take a look at the front legs here, you'll see that they will need a mortise that connects from here to here, because this 12 degrees is going to come in, and then we'll need another mortise for the rear legs. You see I've had them marked already, where will come in for the rails on this location as far as the upper rail and the lower rail is concerned, and then the rear apron will be right here. Okay, so this helps you give a little visual representation of what the chair will look like as far as where the mortise locations are. So the front legs, as you take a look at them from the front of the chair, looking this way, the legs are not like this, but instead they meet kind of like this. So what you want to do now at this point is mark these. I'm not sure how you do your marking and measuring, but for me, I like to mark everything as I'm facing the chair. So for me, since I'm facing the chair this way, this will be my out front right. This is my out front left. The next thing you need to deal with is the rear legs. Now the rear legs are a little different. We have only 3 sides that we have jointed. Okay, we jointed the inside face, the front face, and then the rear face. And we did not do the outside face. So we need to take a look and decide which direction we want our legs to go in. So we have a couple of options. There's not as many as we would have had if all 4 faces were. We have a few. We have a little bit of a cathedral pattern on this part of the leg. So I want to make sure that this is the top, because I want the pattern pointing up and not pointing down. This one doesn't have as much of a cathedral pattern, but it's got a little bit on the bottom, some of the grains going, so I figured that the grain to me felt like it was moving up. So this is going to be in, front, right, and this one will be in, front, left. Now is we are going to trace the different planes or angles or shapes, however you want to put it, of our legs with these templates. So for this template, what we end up doing is we try to find the front of the template, square it up with this inside edge, because this inside edge here stays straight the entire time. Not the entire time, but up to a certain point, and then it curves over. So we can use this as our index, right? And then we want to flush it up here, we want to flush it up over here, and it should be flush over here. So now what we do is we have, we take our marker, we want to draw in the shape of our front curve for the rear legs. So right now I have both the front angles, the front of the legs here, and we're angling out. So if I flip this down and this one down, and I grab my template, what that'll tell me is that my leg is going in this direction. So my curve is coming up and then to the right here, my right, and over here it's coming up and to my left. And just like before, we want to trace it out. Okay, it's time for us to mark out our joinery. And I got a printout from the plan here. And I'm going to take this template and use it as my story stick. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mark out the mortises for the lower rails. So I'm going to take my square, set that for 3 3/4 of an inch, and mark that out on my template. From there, I'm going to move another inch, so that takes us to 4 4/4, because the mortise length for the lower rail is 1 inch long. The next location of our mortise is 14 1/4 inches high. And that's for the bottom of the aprons, the front, the top and side aprons. Great. And then from there, we're going to go up 2 1/2 inches. I'm going to flip the template on the side and bring all these measurements around. So there we have it. We have the mortise locations for our lower rails and our upper rails on all 4 sides. Well, as I've been shooting this video, I've actually been doing some editing at the same time. And that is prompting this right now, which is I'm reshooting the layout process for the mortises on the rear and the front legs. I've actually milled up a new rear leg. This is going to be a right rear leg, and this would be a right front leg. The actual legs themselves for the chair are done. They're over here, mortised, shaped, sanded, smooth, the whole thing. The whole chair actually is pretty much ready for glue up at this point. But I just felt like I really need to get some better close-ups for you and some better explanations on some things. So let's stop wasting some time and get to it and shoot the mortise locations for the rear legs and the front leg. I have a front leg here, and it's marked right front. So as we face the chair, this is the right front side, and this would be the right out front side. And that would mean that this would be the right leg as well, but it'd be the rear of the right leg. And the rear of the right leg has 2 mortises on it. It has the upper rail and the lower rail. So let's mark out these guys, and once we've marked them out, we can then transfer the location from the rear to the inside here for the front apron location. Okay, I've marked this my right rear, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my rear leg template, this being the bottom where it flares out, and I'm going to align that to the bottom of the leg. And with that aligned to the bottom of the leg, and with about 1/8 of an inch back or so, I'm just going to come in and just transfer the tick marks for the lower rail and the upper rail. Here's where I made the bottom and top tick mark for the upper rail on the rear, and I'm just going to come in and take my square and draw my lines. And then I'm just going to bring up the bottom and draw my lines for that mortise location as well. Since this is the rear, and I've marked this side as the out, then that means that this side here is the inside. Okay, and that means that we have a mortise location here as well for the front apron. So you can just come here and take your pin and transfer over your tick marks, or to make tick marks from the lines. And then you can bring down your square and just transfer across those tick marks. Now we've transferred the tick marks for the rails and the apron. What I want to do now is mark the location of the mortises along the width right here. Now we're going to look for, or shoot for, 1/8 of an inch reveal right here. Now that 1/8 of an inch reveal is going to be from where the apron or rail comes in to the leg, so it's most outer edge. So if we want to have that reveal, if you consult the plans, you'll see that in the notes it'll say that all side rail mortises should be cut 5/16 of an inch in from the outside edge. And here I've marked out, up on the top, right out. So that means we got to come in 5/16 of an inch. And if we come in 5/16 of an inch and center our mortise, or excuse me, our tenon on our rails, we'll have an 1/8 of an inch reveal. Now, here's what you can't do when you do this. What you don't want to do is set your square for 5/16 of an inch and come in from the side that has an angle coming up. What all that's going to do for you is create more space, or a space between the actual square. If you can see it right there. It creates space between the square and the leg itself. That doesn't do us any good. So what we need to do instead is, with our square here, line it up flush to the edge, and then just come in and mark where 5/16 of an inch is. And once you've marked where 5/16 of an inch is, then you can come in from the other side, which has the point that's coming up like this, and then strike your line. And that would mean that your mortise would be right here. This is your 3/8 of an inch mortise. And you would do the exact same thing on the bottom. We're going to do the same thing here for the apron as well. We would also come in, if this is the front here, this is the rear, we want to come in 5/16 of an inch over here. So right now, I'm pretty sure, let's just test it. I'll make a little line. And sure enough, because these dimensions are the same, this is all 1 3/8 of an inch square, but a parallelogram. So each side is 1 3/8 of an inch. So sure enough, if we just come over here and draw the same mortise location, we'll be able to come here and mark where the mortise is for the front apron. Okay, well, we are looking at the rear leg, this being the bottom of the rear leg, and up here is the top of the rear leg. Now I have my pattern drawn in for both the front and the side. And just like the original legs, I was not able to completely plane everything down, coplanar on both sides. So I'm actually really smooth over here, except for this little piece here. And that's okay, because you can see on my template, which I'll put on top, that I'm actually not even coming close to this area. So if I was to use this board as a rear leg, it would be okay, because I got a lot of room to put this board onto my routing template and have it be stable, and I'm not coming near any of this wood. Now for the other side, the outside, that's fine too, because I am going to be removing all this material here, and all this stuff here is going to just disappear, and we'll have a nice smooth surface that's also this shape. So what we need to do now is transfer the mortise locations from the front leg to the rear leg. And with the two of these flush to each other, I now know the location of my lower and my upper mortise. So I can just come here and take these tick marks up, or make tick marks. And with those tick marks made, I can now grab my square and just bring up these lines. While I'm here, I might as well also bring across the lines for the rear apron as well. Now I've marked both the upper rail, lower rail, and the rear apron. Now what we want to do is basically the same thing on the rails that we did before, which is to mark in from the outside 5/16 of an inch. And let's talk about that. Okay, right now we are looking at the upper rail mortise location for the height here. Now what you'll see is that we have a line here, and that line for us is indicating where we will eventually remove material. And so for us, this line is actually the out, or the outside edge. And since that's the outside edge, what we want to do is come in 5/16 of an inch from that outside. So I'm going to take my square here, bring it up, and find where 5/16 of an inch is, and make a mark. And now that I've made that mark for 5/16 of an inch, I can come in and reference from my square edge, which is the edge between the front and the inside, where the rear apron would go and the rails would go. I come in from here, reference that, and then mark out where my 5/16 of an inch is and where my mortise is going to be, or at least the waist for my mortise. And then I can just do the same for the the lower rail as well. Now what we want to do is locate the mortise for rear apron. The rear apron is a little bit different than the rails because one, this is the thickness of a rail. That's 3/4 of an inch. And it has an angled tenon. The rear apron is 1 1/16 of an inch thick and does not have an angled tenon. It has a straight tenon. But its tenon is also offset from the center of the piece, whereas in the rail, the tenon is centered on the piece. Why is it offset? It's offset because what I wanted to do was move the tenon back as far as I can, with still a lot of strength in the tenon, to help reduce the amount of material that I have to remove, because both of these pieces in the back will intersect. And you'll see here, I actually have an indent or a dado or a groove cut on the side here. And I've had to lose a little bit of material in order to allow the apron to come into, the rail to come into where the apron is, because the mortises intersect each other. With that in mind, and if you look at the plan, you'll see that I've set the wall of the mortise back 6/16 of an inch instead of 5/16 of an inch. It's a little bit of, instead of a 1/2 of an inch, sorry. I mean, if you look at the plans, you'll see that I've set the mortise location back 9/16 of an inch. So I have my square now set at 9/16 of an inch, and I'll strike a line. I'm going to mark where my waist is. And you'll see that I still have a 1/16 of an, I mean, I still have an 1/8 of an inch reveal here at the top. It's going to be thicker at the bottom, and that's because of the shape of the leg. It's coming up, curving in, and then curving back out. But I wanted to relieve an 1/8 of an inch reveal here at the top. Okay. So that gives me a nice location for my mortise. Then you'll see the mortise is offset, and that gives me an 1/8 of an inch all around. This is a jig that Michael Fortune designed, and it's been in a couple different issues of Fine Woodworking magazine. And I'll have links to this jig for you. It's a great jig. It's for router joinery, for cutting mortises. So what you would normally do is you would set the router on top, and with these guys up here, you would set the distance of travel for the router, front and back. The space in between here is the same space as the width of your router. So this one's set up for my DeWalt router. Then these knobs back here, you can loosen them and you can move the entire assembly. So what I did here was I retrofitted the jig. Usually there's some clamps that come out through here and you can register your workpiece against it. Or he has another fixture you can add on top which gives you a little bit more distance to clamp down on. But what I've done is I've outfitted it with our piece that we cut for our jig. Now you don't have to build this if you don't want to. You can use a Hollow Chisel Mortiser. So let me tell you how I retrofitted our jig to the router jig. I took the jig that we cut and I marked the center point. And then from the center point I came out 3 inches on each side. I then took the measurement of the distance between here and here, marked the center, so I knew where I'd want to drill. I went over to the drill press, and at the drill press, I took a Forstner bit and drilled the depth that I wanted for the screw that I had. So I had half the screw protruding out of the back of the piece, and that gave me the depth I wanted to drill to with the Forstner bit. So I drilled down, I changed bits out, I took an 1/8 of an inch bit, and I knew if I had enough room with my bit to start the hole at least. So since I started the hole on the drill press, I came over to the table here, and with an extended bit, so another 1/8 of an inch bit, but an extension bit really long, and with my hand drill, I drilled the remaining portion of the distance all the way through with a backer board below it. Then, after drilling that hole, I took the jig and I clamped it into the router jig so that the top of it registered to the top of the jig. If it clamped in, I then took my drill again, drilled the rest of the distance through to allow a relief area for my screw to screw into. Then after those 2 holes were drilled, I put my screws through with an extension to allow me to take a screw bit and attach that. So screw that all in, and after all of that, here we are with my retrofitted jig that Michael Fortune designed for himself and showed in Fine Woodworking magazine a couple different times. Just go online. If you don't have a subscription already, it's the best 30 some odd dollars you can spend every year as far as woodworking is concerned. If you did want to use your Hollow Chisel Mortiser, that's fine. So basically what you would need to do is you would take this piece that we made, and you'd want to use that and push that against the back of your Hollow Chisel Mortiser's fence. Actually, before you do that, what you'd want to do is you'd want to set up your bit so it was squared to the workpiece. How can you do that? Well, you would probably want to take another piece here that was square and 4-sided and get that bit set up. And once you have that bit set up, then you can take this piece push it back, take your leg, put it into the piece, and you would set the depth for the hollow chisel mortiser. So like on my Powermatic here, I can then lower my bit move the fence back and forth, find where I want to be, clamp it down, and with that clamped down, and with this piece that the cutoff from our jig, you can either use these clamps here if you have the room, or if you don't, just apply pressure forward as you're pulling down the head of the hollow chisel mortiser to make your cut. You may also want to experiment with grabbing some clamps and clamping this whole assembly together right here, and then that way you can just provide pressure in the center. Either way, all the mortises for the front legs can be done on the hollow chisel mortiser. We're at the bench right now, and let's take a look at the setup. So the first thing I did was I brought the jig over to the bench. I secured it with my tail vise between two dogs. So now it's not going anywhere. With the tail vise securing the jig, the next thing I did was I got my piece into the jig and clamped it up. So I got my leg in, I got the outside wall that we marked on this side of the jig. With all that set up so far, I came over, brought my router over, put my 3/8 of an inch bit into it. And then I set my depth of cut to just a little bit over 3/4 of an inch. So what we need to do is move the jig back and forth with the router inside of it. We want to find what the distance of travel is. So for instance here, I plunged down, I found the line, and that's the outer edge of my mortise wall. So the outer edge of my mortise wall marked, I'm going to bring my little stop here in, and then as I move over, I'll find the other edge of my mortise wall and bring my stop in. So now my router is only going to travel between these two spots. Before I did all of this, I forgot to say that when I got the jig clamped up, I took a can of paste wax and a cloth, and I applied a whole bunch of paste wax to the surface of the base as well as the runners and then the ends here, and then I applied another coat to the base of the router. The next thing to do would be to rotate the cutting bit on the router to help us find where the top of our bit would be to cut the outer edge of our mortise. Now don't go too fast on this, make sure you get it all set up properly. The last thing you want to do is to cut too far over and not have enough material. Okay, small mistake. I'm used to just doing this and not talking it through. I had forgot to take into account the thickness of the base when I set up the router. So I did 3/4 of an inch, or just a little bit thicker than 3/4 of an inch, when I needed to actually do with 3/4 of an inch plus a 1/2 inch. And depth of cut here actually needs to be just a little bit more than 1.25 inches. So I'm going to reset up the router and come back. Okay, I reset up the depth of cut. Now we're just a little bit over 1.25 inches. We'll get my safety gear on and we'll cut this mortise. Unfortunately, I didn't realize that the microphone batteries were dead at this point. What I'm doing right now is I've unclamped the jig and I've moved the leg down so that the lower rail mortise is centered inside of the window on the jig. With the lower rail mortise centered into the window of the jig, now you can go and clamp up the jig again. You'll see here I'm grabbing some quick clamps in a second to help me bring all this together with just two hands. Once all of this is clamped up together, the next thing you need to do is just set the travel distance for the router and the jig. No need to reset the depth of cut. You're ready to go. I took the jig off the bench and moved it over to the table, but we finished all the mortises for our front legs. I got the top mortise and the lower rail mortise for both legs done, as well as the front apron or rail mortise for both front legs done as well. These look great. I hope you really like the jig if you built it. If you did the Hollow Chisel Mortiser, that's great too. You'll see I have a slightly different setup now. So what I did was I took my rear leg and I clamped it to the bench far away from where the router is going to be. The next thing I did was I put my edge guide onto my router. I was able to set the bit to reach the outside wall, the line that we made. So I got that set, and the next thing I did after that was I took two pieces of plywood that I have sitting around that I usually use for this, and then what I did was I took the bit, rotated it, so at the very end of it, the edge was protruding this way, and then I plunged it down just so it would touch, and I found the point of which I think that my bit reaches my line, and that's where I clamp down my plywood on both sides. So now what we're going to do is make the mortise for the rear apron first. I need to reset the depth stop for the plunge router. I did that before this, but I forgot to tell you to do that. So before we had it just north of 1.25 inches, we have to reset that plunge here for 3/4 of an inch. Okay, we got this mortise cut, but I just wanted to point something out, and that is that we cannot cut these mortises over at the Hollow Chisel Mortiser unless you were able to joint this edge and plane the other edge. So you had enough wood in your original piece that when you planed on one side and jointed on one side and planed on the other, you were able to get 1.875 inches. If you were like me and you weren't, you could not cut this piece over at the Hollow Chisel Mortiser. You can't do that because the bottom and the top are not coplanar. So this is a great solution for cutting this mortise either way. The fence guide and these two stops here make for a nice, really clean walled mortise. Okay, I got my setup now for this mortise. I adjusted my fence stops, so I'm stopping at the front of the mortise, at the top, and then the bottom of the mortise here. And I readjusted my bit so that I'm cutting on the waist side, and I'm referencing the leg for the fence. The other thing I want to say is I don't have as much, the router base is not resting as much on the legs as it was before. It's still a good amount, but I just want to make sure that most of my pressure is applied on the right side. So I'm forcing the router down, and I'm using the left hand to guide the router against the piece. Okay? Alright, let's throw some safety gear on and cut this mortise. Okay, I reset up for the last mortise, and all we need to do now is take this guy out, and all the mortises for all the rails and aprons have been cut for our chair. So let's get some safety equipment on and get going. You may have used the Hollow Chisel Mortiser for the legs, the jig that we made, the front legs that is. You may use the Hollow Chisel Mortiser for the rear legs as well, for the side rail mortises. And hopefully use the router for the rear rail mortise, unless you were able to joint and co-plane both sides, which I wasn't able to. So far we've got our mortises cut on both of all 4 of our legs. The next step is to make all of the aprons and rails for the chair.